Okay. Now, on the phone with us, I love to do this every time. Representative Alex Grayson from Florida. Representative Grayson, how are you?
Good. I'm jazzed by that music.
All right. Well, you know, you're one of the few Democratic fighters we have, so we like to break it out. In any opportunity we have, and we don't get a lot of opportunities. So let's talk financial reform. That's what's happening right now. We have a version in the Senate. It appears there's reporting now that the Senate Democrats are battling as to whether to make it more progressive, less progressive. I'm going to guess that they're going to go the less progressive route. So now you're in the House. If they come out with the Dodd version, Dodd / a couple of compromises with the Republicans, would you guys vote for that in the House, or do you need it to be tougher and stronger?
Well, that's going to be up to the leadership, but generally speaking, Barney Frank is not shy, and if he doesn't like what's in the Senate bill, he'll demand that they compromise and come up with something halfway between the two bills that both the House and the Senate will vote on again after a conference.
Well, let me ask you a specific question about the bill, because, you know, we have that $50 billion fund, and Mitch McConnell came out and said, oh, that's a bailout fund, and then he was proven, obviously, of course, completely wrong because it's not based on facts. The banks would pay into it, not the taxpayers, right?
Right. Well, among other things, I mean, the purpose of it is not to bail anybody out. A bailout means that you're giving people money they're not legally entitled to. The fund that we're talking about here, which comes out of the bank side, is simply for administrative costs if there's future bankruptcies that require administrative costs.
Now, there are many different sources, and when we had one source, I wasn't even sure that it was true because it seems so astounding. But now almost everybody in Washington is reporting that the administration is pushing to take out that $50 billion fund. Look, I got to be honest with you, that smells of and reeks of weakness. Do you think that's a terrible idea? Do you think it's weak?
Honestly, I'm not really up to date on that. I had not heard that before. I don't know if that's the White House's position or not, but you got to pay for these costs somehow, and I don't know what their plan is to pay for them otherwise.
You see, that's the other part of it I don't understand, Congressman Grayson, because they assure us, Larry Summers, Tim Geithner, everybody else, oh, don't worry, we won't have the bailouts anymore. But, you know, especially without the fund, why? I mean, if these giant banks go under, aren't we stuck in the same exact situation we were before the reform bill?
Well, under the House bill, no, because the House bill specifically says that you can't use the money that's under the bill in order to give people more than what they'd be entitled to by law. The Senate doesn't have that provision, and therefore the Senate bill could, basically represent a loophole that would allow future bailouts, and I've written about that in the Huffington Post and otherwise. I think we need to clean that up, make sure that that loophole doesn't continue to exist, because I don't think people will stand for any more bailouts. They just hate them. And I think the White House needs to be, more cognizant of that. They seem to think that it's somehow appealing to the House and the Senate if they have the authority. The White House has the authority to have bailouts without the House and Senate approval. But I think that we'll all end up suffering for that if that actually happens, because people are fed up.
So let's go back to the Senate Democrats for a second, because that meeting is critical, where they're going to make the decision to either be bipartisan and water the bill down a little further to work with the Republicans, or if the progressives win, Sherrod Brown, Bernie Sanders, Maria Cantwell in this case, and Ted Kaufman, well, then they would fight and say, okay, look, let's make this as strong as possible and force the Republicans into tough votes.
Well, the sad thing is that the banking lobby starts with 41 votes, and those are the Republican votes. And then it's up to the Democrats to overcome a filibuster, to put together a majority, and so on. But that's the really sad thing, that the Republicans are so dead set against anything that resembles rational economic management.
Well, but it's also on the Democrats, who have 59 senators, to say, hey, you know what? You want to filibuster in favor of Wall Street? Have at it, Hoss. And you think they're too reluctant to do that?
Well, that really doesn't appeal to me at all. I want to see the problem solved. I want to pass legislation that actually deals with the problems that existed that led to the virtual financial collapse of the country, and make sure it doesn't happen again. I'm not looking to make some kind of political point. They're filibustering everything. If you introduced a resolution lauding motherhood and apple pie, they'd filibuster that. But the point is, we have to somehow get beyond that and solve the country's problems.
Well, I think we would get beyond it if the Democrats fought on that issue and embarrassed them by doing that tactic. But of course, our goal is real reform. And Congressman Grayson, that's what I'm worried about here. Honestly, I don't think the reform packages are nearly strong enough. And right now, after even if the House version passes, they'd still be able to make giant side bets, what they call these naked credit default swaps. I mean, you don't stop them. And
you're right. You're right. The Senate bill is flawed in other respects as well. I mean, one issue that we've looked at very closely because I've been so deeply involved in it is what it says about auditing the Federal Reserve. We badly need to audit the Federal Reserve because the Federal Reserve does secret bailouts and doesn't even account for them or tell the public about them. They basically just give money to their friends. And there's no current authority that would prevent that or even let the public know it's happening. As I said, on many occasions, the Federal Reserve can give $1 billion if it wants to a fledgling promising institution called the Dick Cheney Savings and Loan that exists nowhere except in a numbered Swiss bank account. That we can't go on like that. The Federal Reserve is handing out billions, even trillions of dollars, and we need to know where the money's going and making it accountable. The Senate bill does not do that. The House bill does it. The Senate bill doesn't do that. So this is another example where, far from trying to water down the bill in order to placate Republicans, which is a game that simply doesn't work, we need solutions to people's problems, whether they're considered progressive solutions or moderate solutions or whatever. We just need to solve the problems. And the Senate bill, in some respects, is flawed that way already because the lobbyists have had too much influence over it already.
We're talking to Congressman Alan Grayson from Florida. Congressman, speaking of secrets, I know you care about this as well, and you've done some work on it. AIG is saying that even though they're owned by the American people, they will not give over their memos, their emails, et cetera, so we can figure out why they lost $182 billion that we had to fill in. How do you get them, if they're owned by the government and the United States taxpayers, to give us what we're asking for?
It's absurd. Almost a year ago now, I asked Liddy, the head of the company, just tell me the names of he said that between 10 and 20 people were responsible for the collapse of the company and sticking the taxpayers with the bill over $100 billion. I said, just tell me their names. He wouldn't tell me their names. He said, it might hurt their reputations.
I should hope so.
and I said to him, how do we know that these same people working for AIG aren't doing the exact same thing right now for Bank of America or for Goldman Sachs? And he said, you don't.
Well, here I'll be honest with you, what that problem winds up being is that the guys who could turn over that information are the trustees and the directors. And they've been appointed, a lot of them have, including two recent ones, by Tim Geithner. So they get their marching orders from Tim Geithner, and he's telling them not to give you the information you're asking for.
Well, this is what subpoenas are for. I'm going to have a long conversation with the chairman, and we'll see if we can make any progress. I sent over a request to AIG for that information, and I haven't gotten anything yet. In fact, it took them quite a long time just to get back to me. And they have to understand that the reason why we have a Congress in the first place is not simply to pass laws, but to find things out. And when you're talking about the expenditure over $100 billion of the taxpayers' money, we need to find things out. There's been nobody who's been held accountable for the AIG collapse, not one single person. I gave a speech on the floor after it happened explaining what their bizarre business model was. And even at that point, it fell on deaf ears because nothing's been done to prevent exactly the same thing from happening again. And it's simply unacceptable. This is why people are starting to feel bitter about the government, because they see that there are these huge problems, these huge mistakes are made, and nobody's held accountable. As I said recently, at least in Japan, they have Harry Carey. Here, nobody does anything. Nobody takes responsibility for their own mistakes.
I have to be honest with you. I got to put it on the Democratic Party, and I'll tell you why. Because we already know that we've given up hope on the Republican Party. Yes, you're right. There's 41 votes in the Senate for any bankers' propositions, and they're going to fight you tooth and nail. But the Democrats, the Republicans barely pretend to care about the people. But the Democrats are supposed to be on the side of the people's side. And they a lot of them take the same corporate donations, and they're not getting the job done. And so I don't know how you fight that fight within your own party. I mean, you got Tim Geithner and Larry Summers. Larry Summers today saying within the administration, no, the big banks are perfectly fine. They don't need to be broken up. In fact, it'd be more dangerous if we broke them up, that they're perfectly safe in this colossal size that they're in. That doesn't make any sense. How do you fight them on that?
Well, I think people understand in this context the crystal clear difference between the parties. In any crisis, you can do something, And one thing you can do is make things better. The other thing you can do is make things worse. And the Republicans are bent upon deregulation and going back to the situation as it was right before we came across this banking collapse 2 years ago. And essentially, the only law they respect is the law of the jungle. So I think people understand that that's only going to make things worse. Now, the other choice that we have is to make things better. And people do count on the Democrats to do that because we're, in essence, the party of good government, and the Republicans are the party of no government. They believe in basically that America should look more and more like Somalia over time. That's their ultimate goal, the war of all against all.
So you mentioned subpoenas earlier. Final financial question for you. You know, Goldman Sachs is now being investigated, of course, by the SEC, civil fraud charges in regards to a very specific deal. But, you know, they made the $13 billion deal with AIG where they shorted all this other assets, some of which they put together. So shouldn't that be the much larger investigation? Because, of course, that was $13 billion of our money that they got through that backdoor bailout. Shouldn't the SEC be looking into that?
Well, we do have a commission that's been appointed to look into that. We'll see how they do. They just got started working only a little while ago. But that's certainly within their jurisdiction. And I think that the SEC should also be looking into it to see if any securities laws were violated. But honestly, what happened is, if you really want to know, the people in charge at the Treasury and the Federal Reserve made a conscious decision that they were going to hand money over through AIG to not only Goldman Sachs, but a whole bunch of institutions, giving them more for their money than they otherwise would have gotten. And that's called a bailout. And it's not any mystery that it happened. It's not any mystery that they shouldn't have done it, because Goldman Sachs itself said they didn't need the money. Goldman Sachs testified before my committee that if they had not gotten that money, not only would they not have collapsed, but they wouldn't have even lost any of the money because they say they were hedged. So I think it was a terrible mistake to spend taxpayer money that way, and I think it's a mistake that we can't afford to repeat.
Yeah, I can't believe they said that. When I saw that, I was like, all right, great, then give us the $13 billion back. If you didn't need it, why do we give it to you? But, you know, Congressman Grayson, you know, the problem is it keeps going back to the guy who made that decision, it's Tim Geithner. So when are you going to ask for him to get fired?
Well, I'll tell you, it is interesting to me that when he tells people that he's against our auditing the Fed provision, what he's really saying is that he's against our auditing the Fed during the time that he was there, when he was the head of the New York Fed.
That is
Seems like a conflict of interest to me.
It does to me as well. So I wonder if he should step aside to avoid that conflict of interest.
Well, at least he should step aside when it comes to blocking our efforts to find out what really happened and then to do something about it.
All right. And then before I let you go, I wanted to ask you about Afghanistan. Real quick, thoughts on what we should do in that conflict. Do you think Obama is the right strategy, or should we go in a new direction?
No, we have to get out.
And so you would do that as quickly as possible, this whole idea of going into, you know, all these Kandahar, et cetera. It's a bad idea. It's counterproductive?
It's completely counterproductive. We're not doing anything useful there. It's simply a foreign occupation, and it's done at an enormous expense in both money and blood. This is a country where we changed the government, an entrenched government, with 1,000 special forces troops. And now we have 100,000 heading over there on their way with 100,000 contractors, and we're spending $1 million a year in order to have each one of them over there in Afghanistan. You know, it takes roughly $200,000 to take a ride into space on a spaceship these days, or at least that's the price that they're pricing it at. And it takes $1 million to send somebody over to Afghanistan with a gun. It's a shocking waste of our money. We can't afford it anymore. It doesn't make us any safer. It makes no sense. There's nothing that we're doing over there that we couldn't accomplish in some better, cheaper way that doesn't involve the loss of American lives. It's colonialism.
Well, as always, Congressman Alan Grayson, very clear. Thank you so much for joining us on the Young Turks. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.